Today I want to talk about 3 key factors that help make Workday so easy to implement and maintain. I'm talking about this from the perspective of IT application controls and security. And so we're going to talk about these 3 factors and then talk about why Workday makes this so much easier. Number 1, in order to implement a typical enterprise application, you would need resources that understand the application well enough to help implement it. We're talking about analysts, change management, project managers, these types of people who will help you to align what the application does with how your business works, and then merge the 2 together and come up with a solution. And I'm not saying that Workday doesn't need these kinds of resources, but what we'll establish is that Workday makes this process a lot easier. Number 2, typically you would rely on the menus within the application. Think back to JD Edwards, PeopleSoft, older versions, SAP, so forth and so on. And typically your vendor will design these menus to reflect business processes. So for example, you would have an AP manager or an AP menu, for example, and on that menu you would expect to have everything needed to maintain the AP section of your business. Well, the problem with that is that quite often these menus either have not enough access or not enough functionality, or they have too much, which infringes on things like segregation of duties and just too much access in general. But overall, what you have to do is then work from those menus as a baseline to design your application, again, to match the way that your organization works. And again, I'm not saying that Workday doesn't have menus. It does have menus, but again, we'll cover why and what Workday does to make the implementation a lot easier in a little while. Number 3, you might rely on vendor documentation. And if the documentation is really good, it will help you to implement the application and again to align how your organization works to how the application works and try and find some middle ground. Now here's where Workday does things so well, and it's quite obvious and it's quite simple for those of you who've never worked with it. Workday has this solution called business processes, and they're exactly what the name suggests. The great thing about it is that you have the ability to design business processes that match the way that your organization works. And again, the great thing about it is that as you're designing the process, you design the whole thing from beginning to end, including any third-party integrations that you might have. And of course, today, more and more organizations are buying other applications, industry specialty applications that integrate with things like core ERP, HCM, and so on. Workday allows you to structure these business processes so that you can combine all of this together into a business process. Now, the other thing that's effective about it from a security, from an identity, from an audit compliance perspective, bringing everything under that umbrella, is that within the business process, you also configure things like approvals, you also configure things like, rescinding the process or the transaction, deleting it, etc., etc. And normally in other applications, you would have to design this as a separate process in and of itself. But with Workday, you design the whole process within one business process, and you can confine certain profiles to parts of that process, because of course, if somebody's entering or maintaining a transaction, you don't necessarily want that same person to do the approvals. And this is what makes Workday so effective. Now, for those of us who work in security, audit, compliance, the thing that you have to bear in mind when you're analysing Workday is that you're now looking at how these business processes are put together and having to identify where any weaknesses might be in their construction. So do you have profiles, users, roles that can enter and maintain a transaction and also, let's say, approve it? And can approvers also delete or pull back a transaction? So these are the things that you have to analyze from a risk and controls perspective. And that's what makes it slightly different to other applications, where typically what you're just looking for is what a role can do in terms of permissions and access and that kind of thing. With Workday, what you're looking at is the business process and then the profiles and how they interact with that process. Hope that's been helpful. If you have any questions, please do get in touch.